Welcome, everyone. Today, we're getting into something that, well, it really shapes how we see the world, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. How we connect, how we understand ourselves even.
Exactly. We're talking about cultural differences, specifically those big ideas around what we call Eastern and Western culture.
Yeah, those labels can be a bit broad, maybe.
For sure. So we want to look at how these distinctions actually play out in life,
Yeah.
especially if you're someone trying to navigate between different cultures.
Mm-hmm. And we've got some really interesting stuff to draw on today. Insights from online chats where people are sharing their own experiences.
Right, and articles looking at cultural dynamics, personal stories about moving and adapting.
And even some of those more academic concepts, but explained simply like individualism versus collectivism and this idea of face.
Yeah, the goal isn't to, draw these super strict lines in the sand.
No, not at all.
It's more about understanding the nuances,
Yeah.
why these things matter in real life.
And maybe what it tells us about living in this interconnected world we're all in now.
Just trying to pull out some key ideas so we can all feel a bit more informed, maybe more aware.
A bit more empathetic, hopefully.
Exactly.
And, right off the bat, one of the first things that came up in the sources was that very question.
Oh, yeah.
Is this simple East versus West divide even, helpful anymore?
Right. There was that one person in an online discussion who really pushed back on it.
Mm-hmm.
They were saying maybe a country like the UK actually feels culturally closer to, say, Japan or South Korea in some ways.
Interesting. Then to somewhere like the Netherlands.
Yeah, exactly. They mentioned things like how you address teachers,
Okay.
using titles and surnames in the UK, Japan, South Korea,
Mm.
which felt similar to them, but maybe more first names in the Netherlands.
Ah, I see. So small social cues like that.
Right. And they even wondered if sometimes that East-West label sticks around just because of, well, stereotypes about how people look. Phenotypes, they call it.
So grouping cultures based on appearance rather than maybe deeper customs.
That was their thought. But then, someone else in that same conversation had a totally different perspective.
Okay, who was this?
Someone who'd apparently lived and worked all over across these supposed Eastern and Western places.
And what do they say? Well, based on their experience, they felt, no, there are absolutely still striking differences, really deep ones.
Tied to core values.
Exactly. They brought up the influence of things like Confucianism in many Asian cultures.
That emphasis on respect for elders, social order, the community good, that kind of thing.
Precisely. And they contrasted that with what they saw as more Western influences, maybe stemming from Christianity or the Enlightenment.
Where the focus is much more on the individual, their rights, their autonomy.
Yeah, the primacy of the individual, as they put it.
Makes sense.
And they also made a really important point about diversity within these huge regions.
Oh, right. Like how mainland China's culture was shaped by the Cultural Revolution in ways that Taiwan or Singapore or Hong Kong weren't necessarily.
Exactly. So you might see certain traditions preserved differently in those places.
Which just highlights that, yeah, Western culture isn't one thing either. Think about the U.S. versus, say, Italy or Sweden.
Totally different vibes sometimes. And Eastern is just as varied. Far East, India, the Middle East, it's vast.
So as one person put it, the line isn't some neat geographical split, East versus West.
Definitely not.
Okay, so if the big labels are too clunky, what are the core differences that keep coming up in these discussions?
Well, time and again, it seems to circle back to this idea of individualism versus collectivism.
Right, that feels pretty fundamental.
Yeah, sources describe individualistic cultures as placing a really high value on, personal freedom, achieving your own goals, being self-reliant.
People are seen more as independent units, kind of loosely connected.
Sort of, yeah. Whereas collectivist cultures, they tend to emphasize the group's well-being. Interdependence is key.
Harmony within the community and your identity being really tied up with your family or group.
Exactly that. And you see this play out so clearly in, family life.
Oh, yeah. How so?
Well, think about, in many Western countries, there's this expectation, often around 18 or so.
Time to move out, be independent.
Right. Focus on your own future. But we heard from international students maybe coming to the U.S.
And they found that really strange.
Totally strange. Some felt the idea of an 18-year-old living alone was just bizarre, almost absurd.
Wow, because where they came from.
Multi-generational homes are much more the norm. Kids live with parents longer. Family is just woven into the fabric of everyday life.
And the whole idea of putting elderly parents in care homes.
Much rarer in some Eastern cultures, according to the sources. The expectation is often that the family, maybe the wife of the eldest son, will care for the husband's parents, often living together.
That's a huge difference in how family structure and responsibility are viewed.
It really is. And it doesn't stop at the immediate family, does it? This difference affects relationships more broadly.
How we approach friendships, romance.
Yeah. Sources suggest that in the West, there's often this big focus on finding the one.
The soulmate. Based on intense feelings, shared interests, they have to tick all the boxes.
Right, that romantic ideal. But the potential downside mentioned is that relationships might feel a bit fragile once the honeymoon period fades.
Because it's built on that individual connection and compatibility, so it needs constant work, maybe.
Conscious effort, yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas from some Eastern perspectives, relationships might be seen more as arising from circumstance, shared lives.
Less about a lightning bolt, more about a shared path.
Kind of. And love isn't just that instant spark, it's viewed as a choice, something you build.
Through shared experiences, forgiveness, working at it.
Exactly. Chemistry might be seen as something deeper, like a strong friendship, not just that initial sizzle.
Interesting. And what about how stable relationships are?
Well, in many collectivist societies, relationships often have what's called lower relational mobility, meaning your connections, family, community tend to be stable, long-lasting. You don't just easily swap them out.
Okay, so because those relationships are kind of fixed.
Maintaining harmony within them becomes super important. You work harder to preserve the bonds you have because forming entirely new ones isn't as easy or common.
Whereas in the West, maybe it's easier to find new friends or partners.
Which, ironically, might mean people feel they need to put more effort into communication and self-disclosure to keep those individual-based relationships strong.
It really shows different blueprints for connection, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And this individual versus group thing pops up elsewhere, too, like how people handle conflict.
Is it about winning your point or finding a way to keep the peace?
Right. Competition versus accommodation. Even laws can reflect it, protecting individual rights versus, say, group interests in labor laws or public health decisions.
Okay, so beyond individual and group, what else came up as really distinct?
Another big area is around hierarchy, communication styles, and that really fascinating concept of face.
Ah, yes, face. Let's start with hierarchy.
Generally speaking, sources suggest Eastern societies often have a stronger ingrained respect for authority, age, seniority.
Decision-making might follow those lines more strictly.
Often, yeah. Like that example someone gave about teachers.
Addressing them by title, Professor Smith, Mrs. Jones, rather than just John or Mary.
Exactly. It's a small signal, but it points to that respect for position.
Whereas Western cultures tend to lean more egalitarian.
Generally, yes. There's often more encouragement to question things for everyone to participate in discussions, regardless of rank.
Okay. And communication styles, that's a big one too, right?
Huge. Communication in the East is often described as more indirect, relying on nonverbal cues, understanding the context.
High context cultures, they call them sometimes.
That's the term, yeah. You have to read between the lines a bit more.
Whereas in the West, it's often more direct.
More direct, explicit. Value is placed on clarity, getting straight to the point. Low context.
Which brings us to face. This isn't just about, your actual face.
No, not at all. It's a huge sociological concept. It's about your public image, your dignity, your standing within the group.
Your reputation, your honor.
Exactly. And it's something you really strive to maintain or even enhance. Losing face is a big deal.
And it's particularly complex in Chinese culture, right? Mianzi.
Yes, Mianzi. Sources explain it has different layers. There's the status part, your reputation.
And avoiding embarrassment for yourself or others, like avoiding public criticism.
Definitely. Those are seen as face-threatening acts. It also influences behavior, like wanting to associate with important people or...
using status symbols, like that idea of brand Mianzi.
Right. Even what you buy can impact your social standing, signal success, help you fit in.
There's that quote about Hong Kong.
Oh yeah, from Michael Harris Bond. He talked about seeing lots of relationship politics.
Name-dropping, wanting to be seen with the rich and famous.
Using fancy titles, lavish gifts, being super sensitive to insult, carefully avoiding any criticism.
It paints a really vivid picture. of how much social standing and avoiding offense matter.
It really does. It shifts the focus away from, say, just being brutally honest towards keeping social interactions smooth, preserving harmony.
And even politeness theories can view face differently.
Yeah, some Western views might link it more to individual autonomy, like, don't impose on me.
While Eastern views might focus more on social identity and the relationship itself.
Exactly. Like certain Japanese phrases, yoroshiku wanagai for example, that kind of acknowledge mutual dependence and hope for good future relations.
It's so complex. And this is where hearing people's actual stories really helps ground these ideas.
Totally. Like that student you mentioned, born in Vietnam, Western education, but Eastern values.
Right. She talked about adjusting, how it took time.
Yeah, and how in group projects, because she came from that more collective background where harmony is valued.
She'd be more likely to observe first, be careful before speaking up.
Exactly. Which maybe her Western classmates initially just saw as being shy.
But it makes perfect sense if you're thinking about group dynamics, indirect communication, and not wanting to risk losing face or disrupting things.
For sure. But she also shared how making friends from all over the world really broadened her horizons, gave her more cultural sensitivity.
And she got to experience that cultural exchange firsthand, right? Joining in American Thanksgiving, sharing Vietnamese New Year traditions.
Yeah, those moments of connection.
We also heard about international students in the U.S.
Finding it really weird that kids were just expected to move out at 18.
Yeah. Having to suddenly learn things like cooking, managing bills.
A level of independence they just hadn't needed back home in a multi-generational household where tasks were shared.
Right. And remember their surprise when choosing majors.
Oh yeah, if they pick something like literature instead of, say, engineering or medicine.
Highlighting how cultural or family expectations can really nudge people toward certain paths.
Definitely. These stories just show that moving between cultures isn't just about learning new rules, it's a real personal journey. Sometimes challenging, sometimes surprising.
Absolutely. It shapes you.
And these cultural differences, they seem to extend even to broader outlooks on life, don't they?
Like how people handle things going wrong.
Yeah, one source mentioned a tendency in some Eastern cultures to maybe find the humor in mishaps more easily.
Roll with the punches a bit more.
Perhaps.
Yep.
Maybe be less stressed about hitting every single deadline and valuing a slower pace that allows for just interacting with people more deeply.
That definitely feels different from that often Western drive to be super busy, always productive.
Focused on efficiency, getting the job done, maybe sometimes forgetting to just slow down and connect.
Mm-hmm.
And there was also an interesting point about dealing with unhappiness.
Oh, yeah.
In the West, the source suggested there can be a bit of a runaway culture.
Meaning?
Meaning we might quickly blame unhappiness on external things. This job sucks, this city isn't right, my partner is the problem.
If I just change my circumstances, then I'll be happy.
Exactly. But the insight offered was that happiness is more internal.
It comes from within.
Yeah, it takes proactive effort. Building meaningful work, nurturing relationships, actually appreciating what and who you have around you right now.
So the external stuff, the place, the job, it's just the backdrop.
Kind of. The real source of well-being, they argued, is the connections, including your connection with yourself.
That's a really powerful way to look at it. Shifting focus inward, but maybe not just on me, but on connection and contentment right here.
Right. And ultimately, what kept coming through from the sources is that just recognizing these differences, trying to understand them, that's the key.
It's not about saying one way's better than another.
Not at all. It's about fostering appreciation, communicating better across these differences.
And just building better understanding globally.
Yeah. So, while those big East versus West labels may be too simple, they definitely don't capture all the diversity.
Right. But the underlying differences, we talked about individualism, collectivism, hierarchy, communication, face.
Those seem very real. And they really do shape our daily lives, our work, our relationships in profound ways.
And hearing those personal stories just drives home the challenges, but also the growth that comes from stepping into a different cultural world.
It's a constant learning process, isn't it?
It really is. So thinking about all this, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? How does your own cultural background shape how you see things, your relationships, what success looks like for you?
And maybe what can we learn from these other perspectives that could enrich our own lives, our own connections?
Definitely something to mull over as you go about your day.